Alright, good morning everyone. Welcome to the stream. Not a lot to talk about today, but we will roll through a bunch of stuff. Just going to wind things in. The wet weather seems to have arrived here in southeast Australia, and the wind, well, the temperature has dropped like they were forecasting, down from the nice 20s we had the other day to, well, I think it's single digits at the moment, but yeah, they finally got the forecast relatively right. I mean, I thought it was supposed to come in yesterday, but yeah, it's here today, and yeah, it's much cooler. I mean, it's nice and dry, and just cool and cloudy when I took the dog for the walk this morning. But um, by the time I got everything sorted this morning and came back, it was like, it's raining already. So we'll see what happens for the rest of the day. It might clear up. I doubt it though. We'll see. All right. Let's get into it. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, it looks like I'm looking off the right side of my screen. Well, actually, it's reversed. It's my left side. Um, that's where it's where OBS is doing its thing. So it is there. Like the the camera is doing the right thing. Okay, so let's get stuck into it. Uh, well, I wasn't originally going to start with this article, but I'm not going to bother scrolling through it because it is basically an ad. Uh, an HR person got sacked and basically put out a press release which convinced the media somehow to run it as an article. Anyway, the the point of the article though, or the point of the press release, is to advertise this person's new clothing brand, business wear clothing brand. But they've couched it in terms of um, the newer generations coming through don't know how to dress appropriately for the workplace. So of course they have the solution. All right. Ignoring the second half of that, the first half is interesting. That the newer generations aren't dressing appropriately for the workplace, particularly for a corporate environment. Um, they don't seem to latch on to corporate wear, appropriate business wear readily. Now, is that because the nature of work is changing and people are becoming far more mercenary in terms of they'll stick with a workplace for a couple of years and then move and they will gain progression in their careers that way? Are they perhaps relaxing clothing standards because a lot of the other, not so much entitlements, the unpaid benefits that would otherwise be part of the workplace have been steadily eroded over time, and people who are only going to be at a job for a couple of years don't see the need to go over the top in corporate wear when they know they're not going to get progressed within that particular workplace. I don't know, possibly. Uh, it may just be a flash in the pan. It's designed specifically to advertise this particular person's clothing brand, which I reckon is more than likely the case. But they're talking about um, almost not leisure wear, but the um, well, back in the day, casual Fridays were still um, semi casual workwear. So maybe slacks and a button shirt, a polo shirt if you were lucky. If you worked in a tech area around technicians, IT side of things, well, they'd often have polo shirts as their workwear because they'd be crawling around getting dirty and stuff, and button-up shirts um, wouldn't be suitable for a workplace like that. And maybe not slacks, but chinos, maybe pushing something a bit heavier. So not quite jeans either, but something that allowed them to not actually pull cables, but get a little bit dirtier to go and do things. Now, uh, outward facing um, employees would obviously be probably more dressed up, but well, I mean, I certainly saw it when I was working around a bunch of tech people. Polo shirts with almost the uniform of the day, and it was only really when they had to go and talk to other people that they sometimes dressed up. I mean, there is a certain, um, I mean, you do give off messages in how you dress, and so it's also a degree of respect for the people you're talking to, as much as it is a indication of your own professionalism of what you represent as well. So yeah, uh, I mean, it's not so much going as far as a uniform, but yeah, it is there. So I mean that just popped up. I thought, oh well, interesting article, and nope, it's the thinly veiled ad, but that's okay. Uh, it does, I guess, raise the question: what's coming down the line in terms of what people are going to expect? Okay. Um, Obviously, people have been talking about the photos of The Rock looking a lot smaller um, than he has in the past. Now, it may be that he's just stopped taking vitamins, special vitamins, and supplements, and this is actually closer to his natural size. Uh, it's possible. Now, rapid body transformation by actors can be dangerous. People were concerned about Brendan Fraser's weight gain for The Whale and for um, Christian Bale's massive weight loss for The Machinist, and the fact that he did movies either side of that, which had him at normal or bulked up, and yeah, I mean, massive weight loss like that, especially if you're not um, carrying excess weight to begin with, can be very, very dangerous for your internals. Um, Even normal weight loss can be risky depending on how you go about it. If you've got to keep your intake balanced so that you're not putting excess pressure on kidneys or heart or other parts of the body. I mean, we talked last week about the bodybuilder who just got his professional um, bodybuilder circuit ticket, who died rather suddenly. And whilst it wasn't made public at the time, and still hasn't, as far as I'm aware, the suspicion was that he was probably um, a byproduct of what he was doing to his body as part of his training and getting ready for comp and all that sort of stuff. So, um, yeah, The Rock has obviously been bulked up quite a fair bit, but at the same time, he's getting older. If you look at Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor of California, even though he was still active, he wasn't obviously lifting anywhere near what he used to. Um, his ability to exercise was curtailed by his role as governor, but he quite obviously was suffering the effects of age in terms of what his physique was starting to look like. He obviously got a lot smaller in terms of bulk and size and everything else. So it is kind of to be expected that at some point the Rock will start shrinking, will start aging. I mean, you look at other pro wrestlers who continue to get older, they, even if they continue to supplement their physique, they still got smaller over time, because they're just next to impossible to keep um, the muscle and the bulk on, even with assistance. So, um, he says I got excited to transform and lose weight and things like that, and says he's eating less, etc. Uh, and people say, look, he's hoping he's not sick or anything, but it was apparently very, very intentional. But the risk obviously is if that's done damage to him. Now, Tom Hanks's diabetic diabetes diagnosis was potentially linked to the impact he's put on his body over the years with weight gain and weight loss cycles for acting roles. Now, I mean, it'd be a little bit of a long bow to draw to make that direct link, but there is no denying that those sort of cycles place excess pressure on the body. It upsets homeostasis and um, particularly like the weight gain. Obviously, it's causing the liver and the pancreas to do all sorts of fun stuff, and then losing the weight again rapidly, and yeah, just cycling like that. It's going to put excess wear and tear on those parts of the body, and eventually they stop working effectively. And in Tom Hanks's case, he's now got type 2 diabetes. Now, it could just be a natural genetic thing. It could just be the fact that he was getting older and this was a reaction to his body breaking down. But it certainly brought up discussion or concern at the time. Well, concern anyway for Christian Bale's weight loss and Brendan Fraser's weight gain. Um, but it's interesting to see The Rock at a smaller size, and hopefully it's a healthier size, healthier size for him long term. Uh, and well, he's 53, so yeah, people are looking at it as yeah, he was taking vitamins to maintain his size, but yeah, he's hoping he keeps his health, but possibly will be a little bit smaller over time. All right, next thing we're going to look at is the outcome, one of the outcomes from the Ben Roberts-Smith BC defamation case. Now, we talked about this last week about the fact it wasn't, well, okay, it was about defamation, but it was almost a proxy battle between two very, very, very deep-pocketed um, sides in the court case. You had Channel 9 on one side, or Nine Media Group, I think they're called now, with everything else. And then you had Channel 7 on the other. Now, the reason it was Channel 7 was because Ben Roberts-Smith VC was working for them at the time, and you had Channel 9 on the other because Channel 9 had made the initial well, had published the allegations. I don't know that they were the first to make them. They were certainly the ones who published it and received the ire of Ben Roberts-Smith VC as a result. Uh, because, well, don't know exactly why, but I'm sure Kerry Stokes, the owner of Channel 7, or um, the chairman for 7 West Media, was quite interested in taking it to Channel 9. And so, whether he fully believed the position of Ben Roberts-Smith or not, he obviously funded it. And so it sort of escalated. I mean, the whole case on defamation almost became a sideshow to the fact that these two behemoths were fighting it out using this as the means to do it. The fundamentals of what happened and to the defamation and everything else, I mean, we covered that previously, so no need to go in and rehash it. But with the appeal failing to be overturned, now the costs are coming down or costs are being assigned, and yeah, you're looking at a $13.5 million bill for a failed court case. Now, I'm sure that there's been plenty of failed and successful court cases. I'm sure it's probably part of it. Huh. Okay, Stokes' private company, Australian Capital Equity. Just reading that there, by Robert Smith and Stokes' private company. I don't know whether to read that you'd say that Robert Smith is part of Australian Capital Equity, or he has a personal stake in the 13.5 million, 13.3 million, and that Stokes is the owner of Australian Capital Equity. Good old English and ambiguity. So, yeah, um, the newspaper's costs, so from the Nine Media Group, $13.3 million worth of cost, and then another close to $250,000 for uh, assessment processes. So that'll be like, I'm presuming, court procedures. I mean, if you've ever looked at taking cases to federal court or Supreme Courts and things like that, they do kind of have a schedule of costs that you can find out. I mean, people just, the lawyer tells them to hand over all their money, they hand over all their money. But the I have seen it for the Australian Federal Court because I was looking at it in regards to trying to work out what court would hear a certain case because one of the parties would possibly be um, a government department if they refuse to allow the um, not sovereign immunity, but if they refuse to penetrate that barrier and release the individuals within the department for prosecution or for, um, yeah, basically for prosecution, it would depend. Like if it was the department defending, then it would be the federal court would be where it enters the system. If it was the individual exposed and allowed to be prosecuted directly, then it potentially would enter in a much lower court. Um, Still, maybe go through a Supreme Court level at the states and things like that. But um, looking at the thing, and so the Australian Federal Court actually has a schedule of costs, and there's like lodging fees, there's motion fees, there's minimum costs, minimum daily costs. That depends if you're going to have a full bench or half bench hearing, all that sort of stuff. I mean, how many judges are going to listen to you? It depends, I guess, on the nature of the thing. And that's even before you get into the costs of representation. And if you do end up in a situation where due to the nature of whatever the court case was, you have to pay costs for the other side, then yeah, they can rapidly escalate. So, I mean, Carl Jobst has found that out with the case Billy Mitchell brought against him in Queensland, and with the findings that were handed down due to the nature of that case, he has the exposure to have to pay the other side's court costs as well. So the finding itself can only be one small part of the overall cost that is borne for taking a case to court or being taken to court. So, and as it says there, that cost doesn't even cover the cost of the legal team supporting Robert Smith uh, or the appeal. And like I said, those appeal costs could be rather expensive too, depending on which court you take it to. Um, so yeah, and then because the case was dismissed and there's basically agreed to do that, there was also an attempt during discovery, I guess, to access internal company communications, which I'm sure that Stokes was very unwilling to let anybody get access to. So, yeah. And the thing is, for the sake of, um, well, basically less than 6 months in court, the cost was 30 odd million dollars, which indicates how much it costs to take a case to court, especially if you've got a team full of silks on both sides. Um, and, well, I don't think they're QCs anymore. SCs and KCs and everything else. Not cheap. So, yeah, obviously it runs over a brief rundown of the outcome of the cost again, which is we've covered before. So, and there you go. The court has ordered Robert Smith to pay the newspaper cost of appeal, which is about 70% of the bills. And it then talks about, well, I don't think he was getting paid millions of dollars by Channel 7 or by Kerry Stokes. So it'd be, well, life-changing amount of money, that's for sure. Um, this I've not heard of before, which is a couple of the papers trying to subpoena Gina Rinehart, so Australia's richest woman, uh, to see whether she has helped bankroll his appeal, or that had been another set of deep pockets in his corner. And it'd be interesting to see where that goes. So it looks like the it looks like this isn't going away peacefully into the darkness. It's still hanging on and coming on. And I mean, I mean, it's possible he was getting paid this much, but he paid a court cost security, for bringing the appeal. So it it's it'll be interesting. I mean, whilst I guess the formal defamation case is completed and the appeals are done, yeah, to see how these costs pan out and whether or not other people were bankrolling him. Well, that'll be, I guess, still more time to see. Still interesting to come down the pipeline. What and who were um, were funding him or not, as the case may be. But no, that one was yeah, that one was fairly interesting. And like I said in the initial coverage of it, maybe just take the hit against your character, particularly if there's strong suspicion and strong enough evidence that whatever you did may be perceived that way. Now, the odd thing is, if people look into who Ben Robert Smith is and look at who his father is, it's odd that he went into a court case like this. Um, I'm guessing maybe his dad didn't give him any advice, or if he did, maybe he was convinced of his son's position. Um, or maybe there was enough uncertainty at the time, or the way the information had been presented, that it was worth a shot. I don't know. But yeah, hopefully this is the conclusion of all of that. All right, what else we got next? Um, this came up this morning, well, last night. There was talk about, obviously, Victoria has gone through and implemented their machete bans recently. Not that it stopped the unfortunate death of two teenagers over the weekend. The state of South Australia has taken an even bigger step, apparently, for banning, sale and display of knives at least, and search powers, and they've also declared machetes as prohibited weapons. Again, I, I, I mean, there are clear some machetes have well, looks like a cookery, but a limited um, everyday use, but there are still places and valid uses and valid reasons for it. Now, Victoria had said, oh no, we only gave one approval for ongoing possession of the machete, but it's one makes me wonder whether it's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic because it's hiding a bigger problem underneath. And if you go look at the Victorian cases or go look at the Victorian experience and I guess reasons for doing so, there were articles that came out over the last, well, showed up last night talking about some of the families in the area involved were now sending their kids back to Africa to attend schooling because it was felt safer, a safer environment for them. So if they're able to do that, I'm guessing um, they're not refugees, they're routine migrants then. But the idea that the families are in the position where they feel that is the safer solution is, I guess, mind-boggling. That an Australian state, well, sections of an Australian state have devolved because of crime, basically, and cultural factors, pressure, peer pressure on the kids, um, undue influence, all that sort of stuff, to the point where people feel safer sending their kids back overseas to attend schooling. The One of the parents came out last night or yesterday afternoon saying that the community had buried in the last 12 months or so had buried 4 kids for all roughly the same reasons. And that, I mean, if you're not trying to take action to fix that problem, how much longer does it need to continue? Now, I'm sure the Victorian government and police are saying, no, but we're working on it. Well, they also took action to suppress reporting that was identifying the, I guess, ethnicity of many of the gang members, or the idea that this was not just a generic teen crime issue, that there may actually be cultural factors at play that need to be directly addressed. That with a focused direct addressing, it well, would be more cost efficient, but would also maybe uncover the root cause, whether that's something that maybe better support could fix, maybe there are solutions that can be implemented into systems to help remove those specific issues, or maybe help focus crime intervention and things like that to make sure that those issues don't then blow up to the point someone loses their life. So, yeah, banning machetes isn't going to stop people stabbing each other or chopping each other up or what happened over the weekend happening again. And sadly, that's, like I said, I think it's performative and it is a lack of moral courage to directly address what is causing it or what is happening, or to directly address the common factors. Now, if it was um, observed or discovered that the the gangs were largely of one ethnicity, or that there was perhaps a degree of organised crime that was coming down gangs along certain cultural lines, it's the sort of thing that should be understood and incorporated into the police response or into and even into the reporting. It's not racist to say that it is a result of things. I mean, that would be like saying when the when border wars. I think some people call them the border wars. Like when um, early in colonial settlement, when white settlers and farmers and settlers were basically pushing further inland and were starting to get into more conflict with local Aboriginal people. It wouldn't be racist to say that it was a conflict between white settlers and local Aboriginal people. If we were to follow Victoria's lead on this, it would have to be there was knife and gun violence between people when it is the violence is based along cultural lines for a very specific reason, i.e., one group of people displacing another. Well, that's how most tribal takeovers happen. But in this case, or in Victoria's case, I think it's a disservice to the families, to the community involved, to ignore or not talk about or not have it covered because, well, generally with attention, things start getting resolved. It was good to see, well, sad to see, but good to see in what the parents were saying and the community was saying that these two kids who sadly died were not part of any gang activity. They were engaged in community sport, they were engaged in various social activities and community programs and things like this. That's a success story. That's what people should be saying. Well, look, it's not a blanket issue. Sadly, they got targeted maybe because of their ethnicity and the fact that there is a gang that may also share that ethnicity. And I mean, I did see something this morning suggesting that it was all because of a meme. Now, it wasn't alleged that the kids who died had posted it, but for whatever reason, they became targeted by the gang. But the success is these kids who could be pigeonholed into the same bucket as the violent gangs, but they're also the success story. They're the ones engaging in the community. They're the ones who have avoided the cycle, sadly, until they become victims of it. But that sort of stuff should be covered and talked about as well. I mean, there's the successes and there's unfortunately some failures. Why are why are the violent ones missing the successes that everyone else is? Is it an unwillingness to engage? Is it maybe the criminal justice system needs to be harsher on their initial criminal activity? Is this the first criminal activity that they've encountered? I mean, in other states with other youth crime, quite often you get a lot of frequent flyers. Violent youth criminals don't tend to start with murdering other people. There's generally a build-up, and they've usually not frequent flyers, but they've had exposure to the criminal justice system repeatedly by that point. And we say we want rehabilitation as a forefront, so it's not a case of locking everyone up and throwing away the key, but presumably something is failing in that process because this keeps happening. And taking knives off the street or away from everyday Victorians, I don't think is going to solve anything. If someone's already committed to a path of committing a violent, brutal act, being told no, you can't have a knife isn't going to stop them. And besides, the shop bought machetes and big blades and stuff, okay, a bit better quality metal, but all it takes is a piece of cold steel and some time, and you can form your own effective bladed weapon from it. I don't know. I I just think that these sort of blanket weapon bans um, are a problem. And I mean, Australia's firearms surrender program post Port Arthur. Yeah, okay. If you need firearms as a farmer, hunter, or whatever, most of them was like you were still readily able to access suitable weapons to do suitable roles, but removing more of them from the community, I think was probably a safer outcome. It's probably a bit harder to have random knife violence like you do the risk with gun violence. Um, I suppose it depends on where you feel comfortable drawing the line. Quite clearly, there are people who felt the line was overstepped with the whole gun buyback program. Um, Here, I feel like this is maybe a step too far. But you look at the UK, where there's similar sorts of legislation and things like that, hasn't stopped gun or knife violence over there. Uh, it, yeah, somebody who has the intent is going to set about it anyway. If they have the motivation to do it, they're going to find the means to do it as well. Okay, that's enough on that one. It is this case again. We briefly covered it yesterday about how there was a lot of bad things associated with it, so we're going to not cover those again. What is interesting coming out of this is the fact that they're now given federal charges against him, against the, okay, we'll go with alleged perpetrator, but everyone's almost certain with what happened. So, because they're now pursuing federal charges, or they've levied federal charges against him, it opens the path to the death penalty and also removes him from um, the revolving door system that he'd been exposed to with what 14 priors, yet constantly being released back onto the streets. There was, I don't think this article says it. No. Yes. No. Okay, so he was, yes. Okay. This one here. Okay, so he also suffered an arrest for repeating, well, was in cut, well, arrested, not suffered an arrest, means two things if you're in a hospital. Uh, Calling 911, claiming people were trying to control him. Well, they were trying to medicate him. But there was also an unsourced report I saw this morning that was talking about the possibility he'd been trying to, I guess, get help in a way, calling 911. It was clear from this report that the alleged calls he was making and the content of them was that, yep, he knew there was a problem. There was a problem, so a psychological, psychiatric problem, and he needed help. Now, some people point to Reagan's shutting down of the mental health asylums as being the start of a lot of this problem. And there's a common refrain out there: bring asylums back. Um, some people turn MAGA around to make asylums great again. There were a lot of abuses in the old asylum system. And I mean, Bedlam, Bethlehem Hospital in London, where Bedlam comes from, was horrific back in the day. It was one of the first psychiatric hospitals as such. Little more than a prison, really. And it seemed that the whole mental health asylum approach in subsequent years never really got better. There was a lot of effort and a lot of people trying, but dealing with the mentally unwell, particularly when it's a long-term mental health problem or psychiatric problem can be very, very confronting. It's very, very difficult to ensure their safety and the safety of the people who are looking after them. And the line between therapy and abuse looked awfully thin at times. I mean, even the idea of ECT at the moment, electroconvulsive therapy, where they put um, electrodes on the side of their head, give you something to chew down on. Generally, I think they do twilight sedation now, but basically zap you to try and fix the uh, signals in your brain. Apparently, it's very effective, probably because people don't want to go back and get zapped again. But that's a procedure that's still in use that appears horribly barbaric to anybody outside of the system. And I'm sure as we go forward in time, there's probably going to be, it's probably going to eventually be retired and looked upon as barbaric and horrific, just like frontal lobotomies. Now, there are people out there with prone to seizures and things like that. Just trying to think of what the name of the illness is called. Prone to seizures who do have implants that provide low-level shocks directly to the brain, effectively. Uh, that for whom that sort of stuff works wonderfully. It's great for stopping certain seizures. Apparently, it's very effective with treatment-resistant depression and a few other things as well. But we're still looking at it as effectively something that appears very, very barbaric. I mean, as it is, even psychotherapy is still relatively new. Um, I mean, Freud wasn't that long ago, and even then, a lot of what he proposed and put forward has been dismissed, overturned, but apparently some of it's coming back into vogue. But yeah, anyway, the failures of the mental health system. Plenty of books out there on it. But is the solution to bring back asylums? Well, it's obviously too late in this case, but uh, would would a mental health response have saved things, changed things? I don't know. Maybe he would have only been in there on a 72-hour hold. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to get a long-term bed or the other support infrastructure he needed. Maybe it was all available to him and he refused to access or denied consent or things like that, and there was no one in his orbit or who had responsibility for him who was able to or willing to take the step to have him committed against his will, that sort of thing. Those sort of aspects are important to find out, but they don't change the outcome of what happened. They don't absolve him of the responsibility of what he did. The other issue, too, I mean, the issue that everyone's looking at is the fact that he was a frequent flyer in the system. That, yeah, 14 prior arrests and still on the streets. Yeah, I mean, sadly, it escalated to somebody losing their life in a very brutal and seemingly arbitrary manner. Yeah. Uh, so it almost seems like, okay, well, the state has now decided to charge him with first degree murder. And this comes down to the whole idea of judicial systems and how the judicial system seems to go soft gloves on people, whether it's an overreaction to perceived injustice that had been handed out in the past, that people were incarcerated unnecessarily, and then also the whole idea of like better to let the one guilty, well, better let the guilty walk free than to hang the innocent. Um, Quite obviously, the balance isn't there. It's one of those things where people generally see the failures, not the successes, and the failures can be very, very, very confronting when they are. And yeah, I mean, the attempt to rehabilitate, we've obviously moved on from the panopticon approach, which was considered very progressive for its time. I think uh, people look at, say, the Scandinavian system and regard it as maybe being too soft. Now, uh, that's the one that, say, Anders Breivik is a long-term resident of. And people look at what he did and then look at the conditions he's living in while incarcerated and say, well, that's a fairly high standard of living. I mean, you don't deny someone their humanity once you lock them up. And so there's obviously a push for some sort of balance between letting them go constantly and locking them up forever. And the idea of incarceration should not be a replacement for treatment of the unwell. And it shouldn't get to the point that we're relying on the criminal justice system to take care of that. And, well, I think another part of the issue is like people getting focused in on um, per capita overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain ethnic groups. If they're committing the crimes, they need to be pursued appropriately by the system. The reason why they're committing the crimes, if they're overrepresented, okay, yep, it's fair to ask, are they being unjustly targeted? Like, is there a policing response that is ignoring equivalent crimes in other communities to focus unfairly on one? Okay, that sort of stuff, we need to make sure that doesn't happen. But if they're being incarcerated and arrested on uh, a an appropriate level based on the fact that they've committed the crime, well, the question then needs to be crime prevention. It needs to be a look at why there are more crimes being committed by those sections of the community, as opposed to just crying that it's police brutality and provocation. I mean, they've said that one of the things that killed the BLM movement faster than anything else was the widespread rollout of police body cams. Now, police body cams, I think, are a fantastic thing. I mean, I'm sure some of the police don't like it, being having looked over the shoulder their entire thing shift, but it's certainly diffused situations far faster now that the evidence is there of what took place, rather than people standing over a dead body or a severely injured individual and it becoming a he said, she said, or he said, they said situation. And so, um, yeah, it helps avoid those sort of situations, even maybe the George Floyd, even Breonna Taylor, Brown, just trying to think what the guy's first name. I mean, even that had a sad follow up recently where one of the people who was involved peripherally with it, who basically came up with the whole hands up, don't shoot thing, himself died by gun violence. And it wasn't due to, I don't think it was due to police. I think it was due to, well, he was shot by someone else in the community. And it's like, well, clearly there wasn't a lot, a lot of the change that people were pushing for or pretended they were pushing for never really made it there. Or maybe the claims that there were deeper problems that needed addressing that weren't going to be addressed by a couple of marches and waving placards needed to happen. Anyway, the sad thing is obviously the case here. But the big thing I took out of this article was the concurrent federal um, case against him. So whilst it says that North Carolina does have the death penalty, though they haven't carried it out in 20 odd years, then um, the federal charges might also lead to that as well. Now, that would then be a very interesting argument once he reaches, assuming he goes through the court system and ends up on death row, federally and state level. which system would take precedence. That if he was able to appeal his state level death row sentence or death sentence and it was appealed or held up or anything like that, would the federal charges still, or would the federal system then still be able to take him and execute him in that regard? Or would it be that all process have to be put on hold whilst one is appealed? I, I don't know that I've heard of any case where that potentially applied, where they had death sentences at different levels being levied. I think that'll be worth keeping an eye on. It'll probably take a year or so, or a couple of years for this to come to a conclusion. Um, it is still, I mean, sad for everything, but it's still a blight that it took this long for really any news about it to come out or any sort of activity or action to come out of it. I also think that if there were people involved in his previous exposure to the justice system, took, well, not mercy, um, gave them undue leniency, then they should also face consequences. Uh, Obviously, being appointed to a magistrate's or a judge position, there is obviously the expectation you're going to deal with some thorny issues, some issues on which there may be no one good answer or any good answer, but there should also be consequential outcomes for persistent um, leniency where it should not be applied. And I don't think stripping them of their registration at the bar is necessarily the right outcome. There probably needs to be um, potentially even incarceration. I mean, everyone else has to face the consequence of their actions at some point. Yeah. So, yeah. And apparently, while the mayor's also come under criticism as well, apparently the mayor is up for re-election at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see whether there is a groundswell to remove her, I think, and see what comes out of that. Okay. Um, I wasn't aware Norway had gone to the elections, had gone to vote. That looks like a. And whilst the left, yep, they're Labour, I was like, pretty sure that's a left party. That, I think, is a bit of a surprise. Obviously, the Scandinavian countries are kind of regarded as some sort of SOCDEM utopia. Well, the reality might be a lot different, but in terms of policies and implementations. And again, the funny thing is, even though you had the protests in the US of no kings targeting Trump, well, and people tended to point to the Scandinavian approach as being great. It kind of ignores the fact that Norway and Sweden and Denmark all have royalty. But we don't expect people to think or think beyond their immediate protest. But I was not unaware of the degree to which uh, a right wing swing or a conservative swing was taking place in Scandinavia. There's been, again, it depends on how you look and where you look, apparently increasing dissatisfaction with the levels of migration, the inability or the unwillingness of those migrants to partake in the Scandinavian society and basically set themselves apart and pursue special treatment. So there is a dissatisfaction growing in things like that. Now, is it enough to bubble up and reach the media, or public awareness? Well, you haven't heard of it, so probably not. But to see this uh, right-wing party or a conservative move push through like it did, okay, that's like seeing Reform get 30% of the vote in the UK. It should send a message to those that have taken or retained power that they might only have one election cycle left before the axe comes for them if they don't change their approach. Now, that doesn't mean by saying the axe coming for them isn't saying that there's a violent outcome. It's just saying that they're not going to get re-elected. I don't think that phrase is very common anymore. Or if it is, probably shouldn't be used much, given the political violence that's been going on of late. It's like we talked about the other day about the Nepalese violence being largely driven because of banning things on the internet. Um, Apparently, I saw some claims, I don't know how backed up they are, that the protesters were throwing the politicians into the river. Well, it's better than throwing them off a roof. Um, and I'm not 100% sure which way the government there was leaning, um, and whether or not that was, I mean, it's been very, very unstable, but I'd have to go and look up whether or not Nepal has been suffering any sort of internal violence. I know Bhutan had Maoist rebels attempting a civil war. Very, very violent people. Um, but I'd have to go back and look it up. I'm sure there'd be some sort of presence, but yeah, I don't know enough about it, to be honest. The other thing out of this particular article that sort of stands out is the statement, which has become a slur driven by uh, progressives, that populism is bad, that the emergence of a populist conservative movement is horrible and should be suppressed and dismantled. From people who argue that politics should be a representation of the population's political will and a representation of what the masses desire, i.e., that the majority chooses, tyranny of the majority, the idea that populism is bad, well, for a start, it just means that the people don't like your position as much as they like someone else's position. But you heard the rhetoric, particularly after Trump or during Trump's uh, first presidency, was this rise of the statement that populism is bad, right wing, in particular right wing populism, but populism is bad. It's wrong. It's fascism or whatever. Well, that means you don't understand fascism, but it's coming from an argument, generally from people who are socialists or socialist aligned, of well, we're supposed to represent the voice of the people. We're supposed to represent the people. Well, it looks like the people have gone over there and decided that this is more like what they want. And it seems to come out largely as a whinge from regressives, who are facing their own consequences, or who potentially are facing consequences for their own actions. And so it's another tool for them to dismiss the will of the people. It's populism, therefore it's bad. But if more people vote for me, it's good. It's not populism, then it's the will of the people. Uh, it's rearranging the language and rearranging it badly. So, yeah. So it'll be interesting to see again what happens in the coming years. Uh, Obviously, there's the AfD in Germany making gains constantly and upsetting the CDU and the Greens. I still think there's fallout happening in Romania from their recent elections. Obviously, there's uh, now I used to call them National Front. They're not National Front. They're something else. the party in France that Marine Le Pen heads up, the Reform Party in the UK, probably because people see the Tories, the traditional Conservatives, as not conservative anymore. So there's going to be a push. Now, funnily enough, it says that there's an initial domination of the campaign of foreign policy with wars in Gaza and Ukraine. There was a small article, a small headline that came out a couple of days ago with, okay, in the context of a bunch of nations saying, oh, we're going to recognize Palestinian statehood at the UN, of some rather progressive governments, nations, who've said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to recognize Palestinian statehood. And that left me scratching my head a little because I'd always assumed that they would have just blanketly accepted that statement given the type of nation they were. And I wondered whether they'd had maybe a negative experience from Palestinian refugees or migrants that they'd accepted into their community, perhaps. Or maybe there was some other underlying reason that was never really discussed. Um, but it also did sort of kick into the back of the mind or into forefront about the role some of the other neighbours in the Middle East have or don't have in supporting refugees out of the Palestinian territories, in particular Egypt and Jordan. Well, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And I think, well, each of those nations have had very negative effects from uh, having Palestinian populations within their borders. Now, it's not to say that there was the entirety of the population that they had within their borders, but there were certainly some very active portions of the population, particularly in Jordan, where they attempted to kill the king. Um, and so you can kind of understand why they don't want them back within their borders. But it's like, well, hang on, if these nations don't want them, and for very specific reasons, does what makes everybody else think taking them in is going to make things any different for them? I mean, people have a right to exist, but at the same time, other nations should be under no obligation to forcibly take in. Ah, it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. I wish. I mean, yeah, and the whole thing from that as well. If we sort of skip past this a little bit, but we'll just finish here. Um, okay, yep, fine. Norway's outcome. End of story. We'll come back to this one. The one here that was more interesting. We'll go to the ABC, I think. Uh, was overnight Israel conducted airstrikes in Qatar. No, that's not escalating things at all. The airstrikes were targeting Hamas leadership. And see, this is the case here, is that the Hamas leadership don't live in the Palestinian territories. They live and raise funds in Qatar, the UAE at some point. They live elsewhere in the Middle East and live in luxury. At least um, Arafat spent a lot of his time in the actual Palestinian territories, whilst also siphoning money out and everything else. But uh, so it's not the first time Israel has targeted Hamas leadership elsewhere in the Middle East. Now they've come out and said that yes, they notified the US they were about to do it. They also notified Qatar that they were conducting a strike against Hamas presence. Now, I don't know the relationship between Qatar and Hamas. I'm sure they know they exist, or they know that there were their leaders within their borders. I don't know what the intent is for removing them. People sort of half see Qatar as sort of progressive, sort of not. I mean, Al Jazeera is based out of Qatar as well. They're not as hardline as other Middle Eastern nations. They're probably more hardline than others. They're an interesting mix. The US has a very big military presence there through Al Udeid Air Base and presumably using their port facilities in Doha. But the prior notification to Doha, to Qatar, there's a question how much of that filtered down to the Hamas leadership. When, if you look back at Rhodesia slash Zimbabwe during that transition phase when Rhodesia was fighting its bush war prior to independence, they did cross-border raids into Mozambique and um, I forget the name of the city that they raided into, but it was known that um, ZANU and there was another couple of other names of independence fighting groups, or largely Marxist slash socialist um, rebels. They were living openly in Mozambique and were being fated by European leaders and things like this. Um, yeah, the whole transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe and the global political winds and everything else. That's quite an interesting thing. So the Rhodesians were conducting cross-border raids from time to time to try and target the leaders, like Mugabe was targeted repeatedly. But in order to do so, they didn't necessarily tell Mozambique what was going on, but they certainly told England, or England found out through various paths, and there was a suspicion that the um, uh, they used various diplomatic channels to warn them, and the leaders were therefore able to escape the outcomes of what went on. Now, that obviously upset the Rhodesian forces involved because they undertook very risky missions for very limited outcomes. It could have been a very surgical strike, solved what they would have seen as a lot of problems, and gone merrily on with their way. With this, where the leadership happened to avoid the strike, yeah, I'm sure there's people that will allege, and we'll probably talk about a link between the uh, the government in Qatar and whatever happened. I'm sure that that might come out in due course. But yeah, I can understand why Israel wants to remove them. I can also understand why people get a little bit sensitive about Israel reaching out into other nations to conduct military strikes. Um, there's got to be consequences at some point for this sort of activity. You want to make sure you're right before you go about it. I mean, it certainly seemed to stop Iran recently, but I think that's more the exception than the rule. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. And sadly, there were a couple of Qataris who died and were wounded as a result. So, yeah, and obviously a lot of people come out and said, "You've done what now?" Yeah. All right. The last thing we're going to look at today is the talking about housing back in Australia. Now, when we have a first home buyers scheme, they've have existed in a various form over time. There'd be like assistance with their deposit assistance with savings for deposits. Maybe first home buyers could access uh, funding with smaller deposits. Basically, there are a variety of mechanisms like removal of stamp duty for first home buyers, certain offsets, a variety of bits and pieces to help people get across the line to be able to get into their own place. You didn't want to be sailing very close to the wind on them, usually, because you'd then still be left with an awfully massive loan um, that you'd really stretched yourself for, and you kind of hoped that any interest rate decreases weren't about to suddenly reverse themselves, because it probably wouldn't have ended very well. The These schemes of their various forms are still in existence, but the government is talking about expanding it at the federal level. So allowing uh, allowing first home prospective first home buyers to access the scheme with, well, more money, or to access properties that are a little bit more expensive. I mean, if the entire market goes up and you've placed a cap on how much money or the cost of a property that you can access under the scheme, it's like you don't want, if the average cost of housing is like 200,000, I doubt anywhere, uh, but you as a first home buyer say, well, I'm going to use it to buy $1 million mansion. The government is like, no, it's not meant for that. It's meant to help you get into your first house. A Probably a smaller house, but it's the idea to get you into the property ladder and get started, not meant for you to be splurging on something massive. Right, good idea, but when the average property price is climbing through the roof and the scheme is not tiered or attached to it, then, well, the available properties you can access under the scheme dry up very, very quickly. So, what it is looking at here, um, they're saying that, look, that they've did a market analysis and only a third could be accessed like under the scheme. So 1 in 3 properties could have been purchased using first home buyer help. And so they want to basically double that accessibility. Okay, clearly you're not going to be able to access all of the market on a first home buyer scheme, but yeah, on average 2/3. And I mean, particularly for the more built up zones and regions and the cities and stuff, yeah, give up on the idea of a freestanding house for a little bit and maybe live in an apartment or a unit for a little bit to while you build resources and equity and everything else to then help you then eventually move up to a freestanding home if that's what you're looking for. Plus, I think the greatest number of available residential properties that are being built now are units, not freestanding or even townhouses. So I mean, it's a good thing. I mean, right there, those incredible figures. If only 8 suburbs had accessible housing, but now 130 suburbs in Adelaide. I didn't even know Adelaide had 130 suburbs. Um, the same for Brisbane. Again, I didn't know Brisbane had 153 suburbs. I mean, if you told me Brisbane had 58 suburbs, I'd be like, really, that seems like a lot. Uh, but that's good. I think this is a really, really good thing to help people get their foot in the door and stuff, particularly if they'd been struggling otherwise to find those accessible housing. However, people are saying that that is going to push prices up. Well, more buyers means um, more options. We had that talked about that article the other day. Um, yeah, I mean when the average house price is creeping over 7 figures in say Sydney, then yeah, rising the cap on what a cost of a house you can access makes sense. Um, it's reflective of the market, which um, I mean people knew for a while that prices in Sydney were starting to climb and settle over $1 million for housing. What had surprised me somewhat, looking at this was going back a couple of years, 18 months, when I think CoreLogic is one of the big property market analysis people. Um, they were showing average house price in Canberra, in the ACT of all places, had nudged $1 million in a bunch of suburbs. Now, if you're talking about the established in a north and in a south suburbs, yeah, okay, kind of makes sense here. They're massive older houses on large blocks, all that sort of thing. But no, they'd always been really expensive. What was nudging $1 million were houses that had been built in the 90s. LJ Hooker type, um, cookie cutter, off the plan type houses, not McMansions. These are the old bog standard, well, double garage, 4 bedroom type places. Maybe not even 4 bedroom, but or even double garage. Plenty of carports. Uh, but Canberra hitting $1 million. Now the reason for that is Canberra doesn't have a lot of free space left in terms of being able to extend for greenfields and things like that. Uh, they certainly used up a big chunk of that remaining green space when they plopped Gungahlin down. And I'm sure they're going to infill in some of the spaces around the place. But by and large, Canberra's lateral extent is probably about done. And so, like Sydney, you're now looking at having to increase the density of the existing housing supply, or, well, knock down and increase density that way, build higher density housing, or prices just shoot through the roof. Plus, Canberra traditionally has a very large percentage of the population that are well paid, good old public servants, and are on very stable incomes. Now, there's also a percentage of the population that's on very unstable incomes, but certainly the public service sectors, government workers, all that sort of stuff, would be regarded as very stable employment. And there's always going to be demand for places to live because government departments like to hang out in Canberra. Uh, so that's why partially Canberra's house prices hit $1 million before Melbourne's average, and Melbourne keeps spreading out. I think at some point Geelong will be merged into Melbourne. It used to be Bacchus Marsh, Point Cook area, Laverton. They were outside of the Melbourne metropolitan area. I mean, you're going back 20 odd years, you're talking a quarter of a century ago. Yeah, okay, things change a lot in a quarter of a century when you look at it that way. But they're now merged in, they're now part of, I guess, the metropolitan area, broader metropolitan area. And Geelong's not far off, I guess. Sydney's always been constrained by geography. Brisbane has been spreading out as well. The connection from Brisbane to the Gold Coast for a while was a highway. It's almost non-stop suburbs now, and uh, I mean they keep making the highway wider and it just gets slower. But it's almost like non-stop suburbs from Brisbane to the coast now. Darwin hasn't. Darwin spread a bit. They had a big push when the rail line got connected properly. Um, they built more units than anything else, and yeah, it hasn't really moved much since. But still, the idea that $600,000 for Darwin, that seems a bit expensive. Adelaide, there's been they have protected green zones in Adelaide to prevent excessive um, creep of the suburbs north and south and into the hills. So they're kind of constrained a little. So what they've done is they just sort of jump the gap and build on the other side. So the super adjacent settlements like Gawler are a lot bigger than they should be, but that's because people then just live there because it's a little bit cheaper, and then just take the road down into Adelaide proper, and it's not that far. Perth, they sort of prepared for the spread many years ago and seems to have been filling in quite quickly. Uh, and I'm not 100% sure about Hobart, but the one of the markers I've always used as a guide for how a city is spreading, particularly an Australian city, is you look at where the airbase, where the Air Force base was or is, depending on if the city still has an airbase associated with it. The civil airfield, the um, civilian airfield, generally is in real close to the main part of the city. So if you look at, say, Sydney, the civil airfield, main civil airfield, is at Kingsford Smith, which is at Mascot, which is Botany Bay, which is not that far from the CBD. Uh, there is another major civilian airfield out of Bankstown, um, but the military airbase in Sydney was or is at Richmond, which is out past Penrith, and so used to be surrounded by farmland, a lot of farmland. Now, a lot less farmland, and it's sort of being swallowed up by suburbs a lot more. They still maintain it as a military base, so that's still going to be there, and people just going to have to suffer for a little, deal with it. Melbourne, uh, Melbourne has Moorabbin, um, and has Essendon. Essendon is in real close to the city, i.e., being in at Essendon, but it's not the major airfield, civil airfield in Melbourne. That's ah, well, Moorabbin is the GAA airfield. The what's the name of it? Tullamarine, which was a fair way out of the city, but it was big, wide open land, so they could build a big, sprawling airfield. That's now being swallowed by suburbs. The air bases in Melbourne were out at Point Cook and Laverton, and like I said just before, they've been swallowed up by suburbs now too. They've not done any real flying out of Point Cook since they moved the old flying school out, but it's still maintained as a training base. Um, Adelaide has, well, Adelaide Airfield, which is right next to the city on the coast. Then they have Parafield, which is a big general aviation field. Then Edinburgh, um, which used to be well north of the city. It had some suburbs around it. When Holden still built cars, they were just down the road from the airbase, so they had plenty of um, industrial capacity out there, and so there'd be workers living nearby. Plus, there are a few other places that set up in the big sprawling areas. Yet now it is also being swallowed by suburbs with constraint because on one side it's still farmland slash unsuitable to build on, but yeah, they're being swallowed everywhere else. Uh, Darwin's airfield, well, the civil and military share it, but it hasn't really been swallowed up as such. I don't think the expansion up in Darwin is going that far. I mean, there'd be more accommodation going into, say, Cullen Bay or in towards Larrakia or even down towards the harbour before they went out towards Berrima. Um, I mean, there are settlements further out, like you go through the various like Palmerston and things like that, but they're satellite towns more than anything else. So yeah, Darwin hasn't really super spread out. It's too hot otherwise. Brisbane, Brisbane Airport is in northeast of the city, towards the coast, but the military airfield up there is out at Amberley, which is out towards the scenic rim. So you are talking well west of um, what's the name of the associated suburb? There's a city that's next to. Um, they keep having issues, but where it used to be completely isolated and had just had local settlement. Again, the suburbs are rolling out consistently towards them. Um, Perth, Perth Airfield is like right in close to the city. They have, so Brisbane also has Archerfield, which is the general aviation airfield, which is halfway between the other two. Perth has Perth Airfield and Jandakot. So Jandakot is the civil light aviation airfield. They're both in relatively close to the city. And the airbase there is Pearce, or up in Busselbrook. Busselbrook? Bustle, yeah. Um, no, wait. Now, now I've convinced myself I've forgotten the suburb. But it used to be like completely isolated, um, relatively isolated from the rest of Perth. But again, the suburbs have crept out, and the airbase is um, not quite surrounded by suburbs, but they certainly are pressing hard up against it on a couple of sides. And so you look at it as, why did they build these air bases in the suburbs? Well, they didn't. They're all built outside the city. And it's just how the cities have expanded. And if you go back and look at the civil airfields, yeah, when they were first being used, they were in on the periphery of the cities as well. So you'll go and look at Sydney now, with their second major airfield, the Western Sydney Airport International. Over time, that's going to be swallowed up by suburbs as well. So all these talks about caps for housing and things like that. Well, I mean, lateral spread is still going on. People are still building. Population's growing. At some point, that spread has to slow down, and people who want to live closer back into the city are going to have to accept apartment living or townhouses, that sort of stuff. So, but I mean, it is good though to see that the government is increasing supply to these programs to help get in. Now, it didn't actually say, um, I mean, the headline said income caps, but there's no mention of what the income cap is going to be. But the key part here is the mechanism of this scheme is 5% deposit and no LMI, lender's mortgage insurance, which is basically the bank forcing you to take insurance so that if the worst happens and you can no longer repay your mortgage, the bank gets their money. Not you, the bank. Um, but that generally is a cost on top. And so when I'm saying about, oh yeah, it offsets these costs, be it stamp duty and everything else, particularly for first home buyers, they're looking at, oh, this is the price of purchasing a house. Well, it might be the list price or whatever the price they've ended up on the contract, but then there's stamp duties, there's title fees, there's title searches, there's pre-purchases, PPIs, there's LMI, there's all sorts of these other costs that aren't well explained necessarily. And it doesn't actually say what the income scheme is. No, just the cap on pricing. All right, 90 minutes today. I think that's pretty decent. Good time to call it there. So we'll drop everyone in a chat, plop some tunes up, and close things out. Nope, that's not music. That's music. Close things out for now. So big thank you to everyone coming out, regulars, first timers, chatters, lurkers, and everybody in between. I very much appreciate having you here. The channels wouldn't be the same without you, and big thank you to everyone across the various channels because we are multi-streaming, so we are appearing in many places to many things. The next stream is tonight. We are looking at what are we looking at? Pillars of Eternity. So yes, that'll be notified in due course. Looking at taking that up at 9 p.m. my time. So that's what 10 hours from now. And I look forward to giving that a crack. Otherwise, next stream we'll be back talking again tomorrow. So look forward to everybody with that. If you're going to keep on top of things, there is a schedule put in Twitch. Not every outlet I can put a schedule on. So YouTube, for example, I can only put one. Well, I can schedule multiple streams in advance. It just gets confused when I go live. So YouTube will only see one stream in advance. But if you want to keep on top of it, the best thing to do is keep on top is to follow the socials, mainly Twitter and Insta. Messages go out both of those before each stream, indicating what my next stream is going to be and the timings, or just hang around for a little bit at the end of stream and I'll explain when things are going to be up. All right, so again, big thank you to everyone, and we will see you all next stream.